Welcome to this conference, Understanding Globalization, organized by the Center of Advanced Studies of Eurac Research here in Bolzano, Italy. We are very happy to have you here, and it will be a pleasure to discuss interesting topics with international experts from different academic fields throughout the whole week. As you know, the conference will take place from today until Friday, always at lunchtime and in the evenings, and you're very welcome to join any sessions you're interested in, or all of them, of course. So now I will hand over to Harald Bechlano, the head of the Center of Advanced Studies, and he will introduce you to the conference and welcome you again.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to introduce and to say hello, to introduce and to open this conference, which is a conference going for a whole week. This is absolutely innovation of the Center for Advanced Studies at Eurac Research, and so I'd like to welcome you in the name of Professor Roland Benedikter, President of Eurac, Stefan Ordner, Managing Director of Eurac, and Roland Benedikter, who is responsible, scientifically responsible for this conference, who had the idea to organize the Globalization Week in the way as we do this week. So there is a certain relevance of the globalization topic, and especially in these times. Globalization affects us all, and that has become increasingly relevant, especially in recent years. In addition to economic and social phenomena, issues such as migration, climate change, technology and health have become the expression of today's globalized world. Particularly in view of the COVID-19 pandemic, in which we are still in the midst, it is clear that the multi-layered global interconnectedness is anything but pausing, rather increasing in speed and intensity. Goods, people, ideas, even viruses are circulating rapidly around the world, bringing entire societies, cultures, and economies into mutual interdependence. While on the one hand, we are talking about increased cooperation between states, institutions, or individuals, other examples show that a retreat into the national, regional, or local sphere can also appear attractive. So how can we understand current global trends against this background? What do they mean for the future, and how we will or our children live tomorrow? These are the crucial questions around questions related to globalizations. And these are some of the questions at the heart of this Globalization Conference or Globalization Week here at the Center for Advanced Studies of Eurac Research. And we will be discussing them with many great experts from various scientific fields throughout the week. What I can say at the moment is that we try to increase the discussions of globalization in the context of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. The Center for Advanced Studies definitely tries to better understand globalization processes in order to be able to deal with and make sense out of relevant problems and challenges. We try to link global issues with local phenomena and to shed light on the existing connections and the multifaceted layers of globalization processes. This is the second edition of our Globalization Conference in a belated format, as it should have been taking place already in 2020. The digital format has allowed us to structure the conference into a Globalization Week. Thus, on each day, a block of topics will be discussed at noon and in the evening hours. Our speakers, just like the theme of the conference itself, are very international, coming from Kenya, Russia, the US, Germany, and several other countries. especially the pandemic is bringing us in a completely different situation when it comes to international connections. Today, the topic of discussion will be re-globalization. On Tuesday, aspects of politics and democracy will be addressed. On Wednesday, global societies will be discussed in depth. And on Thursday, we will focus more specifically on selected regions, for example, Russia or Africa, and their current globalization process. On Friday, finally, the topic will embed the local sphere, as we will talk about globalization and the local provincial context of South Tyrol in the course of a round table. Having said this, I wish us all an exciting Globalization Week, and I'm looking forward to exciting discussions and interesting topics. It's a big honor for me now to give back to Linda and then they give the floor to Roland Benedikter.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harald Pechlaner, for your introduction. Before we move on to the first lecture with Roland Benedikter, I would like to briefly mention some organizational things for all participants. You can find the link with the program for the conference week in the chat. And there you can look up the sessions and the topics that will be discussed by different authors and scholars. And the registration link remains the same for all seminars throughout the week. And you can access all of them with the same link. And you're also very welcome to post any questions or remarks in the Q&A section that you find below the screen. And after each presentation, we will try to answer and discuss the questions with the speakers. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Roland Benedikter, who will open this conference with the first seminar on the topic of re-globalization. Roland Benedikter is a research professor for multidisciplinary political analysis at the Willy Brandt Center of the University of Wrocław in Poland, and he's co-director of the Center for Advanced Studies of Eurac Research. He's also a member of the Future Circle of the German federal government in Berlin, and a global advisor of the Institute for Cultural Society at the Western Sydney University in Australia. His academic work includes societal foresight, interactions between humans and technology, and globalization. And in particular, today he will talk about globalization's current transition phase. So please, Roland, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Linda, for the kind introduction. What I want to provide today is a very brief sketch of where globalization stands at the moment and how it can be understood so to pave the way for innovative concepts such as re-globalization, which is an experimental term. Now, if we take a look at some basic elements, we first of all have to note that re-globalization as a concept has three dimensions, and I beg you to bear this in your head for the following. It has an analytic value, a diagnostic use, and a therapeutic aspect. So it can remember or collect the remembrance about what has happened. It can be used to diagnose the current state of globalization, but it is also sometimes used already to pave the way for a concept that could lead out of the present situation and lead us forward. As of yet, the analytic and diagnostic use is clearly in the foreground, and the therapeutic dimension has to be developed with urgency due to the four characteristics of current globalization, which are anonymously recognized by experts. First, hypercomplexity. Second, deep ambiguity. Third, non-consensual pluralization of globalizations, the so-called co-evolution dilemma. And fourth, loss of control psychology. that is spreading, especially in open societies. I will go into this a bit more later on. But if we want to understand what reglobalization is and summarizes in a single picture, it was certainly the picture of one of the largest container ships in the world stuck in the Suez Canal in April 2021 for 1 week, causing a 400 ships long queue. And interesting symbolic value for this kind of globalization that has been triggered the title Stuck Globalization is that the ship even had a double name on the side of the vessel, Evergreen. The name Evergreen was painted, while the vessel itself is called Ever Given. And some observators, me included, took this as a kind of symbol for the double nature of globalization we had over the past 30 years, from the 1990s to recently. We had a kind of neoliberal globalization, which was the real driving force, symbolized in the name Ever Given, the biggest ever given to the world. We modernize the whole system. We are the driving force, the neoliberal abolishment of borders and the free floating of goods and services. And on the outside, this kind of globalization had painted something green, something innovative. We are doing something good. We are serving the international community, which some consider to be rather a kind of painting on the outside or a camouflage, rather than the real driving forces behind the globalization we had so far. Now, this is perhaps the most telling image of all that is really burnt in my head. The size of the vessel, which is globalization, and the size of the human beings which stand beside it. There is an asymmetry that is catching the eye from the start. Now, this image can summarize the state of globalization as it is perceived, at least, from a variety of angles. First, there is a widespread perception since a couple of years, and this is a recent development, that globalization is indeed stuck, that globalization is congested, that the scale between globalization and humans is not working. Unwanted effects multiply. There is a phase of rupture of known patterns because there are more losers than winners, at least in the perception of a majority of people throughout the world. We are in a phase of non-consensuality due to critical maturization and multipolar approaches. That means that there are multiplying attempts to get a grip on the globalization we had. Think about the new Silk Road of China. Think about what is happening in Africa with a kind of neo-colonial process underway. But also think about what is happening with the Arctic, which is a non-consensual takeover of large parts of humanity's heritage. And this kind of rupture or dysfunctionality of globalization has led to guiding terms for our age, like dysfunctional globalization, indeed, disjunctive globalization, as Manfred Steger branded it, a world without guardian, as Herfried Münkler told us, or the globalization of discontents by Joseph Stiglitz. Most important, I think, is to brand our era as the era of the clash of globalizations. There is not one globalization anymore, but multiple globalizations that exist in a non-consensual, not interrelated way anymore, although this is often camouflaged by goodwill declarations, by agreements that are signed but then not implemented, and so on. For example, there is without doubt a parallel second global order in the making by China's will for not least by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, founded in 2003, and its treaties, but last by the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership signed in November 2020, comprising now 33% of the world's economy and led by authoritarian powers such as China. There are disinformation campaigns by authoritarian regimes with the building of a second reality indeed of globalization, and information and perception-wise, we have a kind of reflection about what is really going on in the world that is competed between Western and authoritarian non-Western views. And this suggests that in this case, the ship stuck in the Suez Canal would rather suggest that Western globalization is derailed rather than globalization as such has problems or is in a phase of deep transition. The perception is getting, in any case, more complex. Globalization is not any longer seen as a simply or merely positive process, but we take note slowly but steadily that the post-World War II order that was connected with the foundation of the United Nations, the refoundation of international relations, the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF, and so on, is shrugged by forces that were not foreseen by globalization theorists and neither by its practitioners, its profiteers. There is a kind of sense that there is a clamped globalization. It is not functioning smoothly as before. Others call it peak globalization. That means economic globalization reaches the limits of its benefits and reaches a turning point out of its natural evolution. That must be the case, so to say, when a certain saturation is reached. There is a rhetoric that the end of globalization as we knew it has occurred, and that means that the so far unholy alliance between neoliberalism as the economic driving force and humanistic hyper-cosmopolitanism as the overarching ideological legitimation is breaking up. The contradictions between these two forces have become too heavy and too obvious, and that leads to a situation where the ideological reflection and legitimation is no longer coherent with the realities on the ground, where neoliberal globalization produces many losses, but does not produce the remedies for that. Is there a maximum entropy of neoliberal globalization? We, without doubt, observe an increasingly negative fallout due to rising inequality, the destruction of the environment, CO2 emissions, over-tourism, increasing split in what worked as unifying instruments. For example, the internet. Since a couple of years, everybody agrees that we don't have one unifying internet, uncensored, in the world that unifies people in a global dimension, but we have at least 5 internets, a Washington profit-oriented nationalist internet, we have a Chinese surveillance internet, we have a Russian nationalist independent internet that can be taken off from the rest of humanity. We have the European bourgeois and privacy-oriented internet, and we have Silicon Valley. So even the most globalizing forces, such as the internet, that seem to be untouchable, are questioned now by the diversification, by pluralization, and by non-consensuality. And all this has led to a crisis of the Western liberal global order and its stabilizing institutions. Nations are leaving the WHO, not least in the aftermath of its treating of the pandemic. The UNESCO is in crisis. It has been left by some of its member states. There are others who don't adhere. New global agreements like the Global Compact of Migration stipulated by the International Organization of Migration, which was incorporated into the UN in 2016. There are cracks in the WTO and in NATO. And according to its own representatives, there is the deepest crisis of global institutions since their inception in 1945. Altogether, this indicates a crisis also of stability. And as a reaction, we see a re-regionalization and de-internationalization of many single questions and focal points, for example, in Tibet, which has always been eradicated from the global landscape as a challenge or a political problem. The Uyghurs, we see new fights for natural resources in the Mediterranean between Turkey and Greece, but also with other powers involved behind the curtains. We see attempts in the South China Sea to appropriate whole new areas that were uncontestedly community-owned. And we see a kind, as mentioned, of a recolonization of Africa. Most important, in my view, we see as part of the current state of globalization that there are anti-globalist, or at least globalization skeptical movements, which are in many cases independent youth movements. And this is very indicative. If the young people don't believe in globalization as we had it so far anymore, they are in their majority both against neoliberal capitalism and its effects, but also against traditional order powers and international habits and agreements. For example, Friday for Future or Extinction Rebellion, who believed that the whole global order we had established so far was working well until a certain tipping point, and that is now and must now break apart if not the fundamentals of globalization are transformed. There are political shifts towards a formalized renationalization even, and we saw that the year 2016 was the annus horribilis, both for Europe and the United States. We had Trump and Brexit just a few months away, indicating a true and deep-reaching rupture with current and planned and saturated internationalism. And I think that the French ambassador to the United States at the time expressed it best when he said, Gérard Araud, after Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, everything is now possible. Our world is collapsing before our eyes. With this, our world is collapsing before our eyes. Araud meant the world of globalization as we meant it, and a hope connected to this world of globalization, that the global process, the process of debordering, the process of opening up spaces would benefit everybody and would eventually lead to a united humanity. This world is collapsing before our eyes. The result is what we have today, a weaponized interdependence, as Harry Farrell and L. Newman have branded it. And to illustrate this a little bit better even, I would like to mention the most two accurate descriptions of the current state of the world that I personally know of. And this is first the description of Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who in the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations in 2020 gave two remarkable speeches, one in January, one in June, about the situation of the world and the perspectives. And the second is the UNESCO 22 to 29 strategic outlook on the coming 10 years. Let me mention first the definition of the reglobalization situation as a constellation by Antonio Guterres. He talked in 2020 about a world that is ridden by the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, this might sound a bit inappropriate to use a symbol of the book of Zechariah and of the Testament of John. But what Antonio Guterres, who is a practicing Catholic, meant was that apocalypse has the double meaning of something that is breaking down or dissolving, but at the same time, exactly in doing so, reveals something new. And it is also a characteristic of reglobalization in his view. He said that there are four horsemen that are dominating the world today. The first horseman is the highest global geostrategic tensions we have witnessed in years, especially between the United States and China at that time, but also with Russia, the mutual discordance with over a variety of questions between Europe and Russia, the non-alignment of Africa and South America, and so on. Second, we face, according to Guterres, an existential climate crisis. Guterres even mentioned that the global warming of the oceans accounts to 5 Hiroshima bombs daily, the equivalent of it. A third horseman is deep and growing global mistrust due to inequality, non-participation, globalization, seen as a natural law, you cannot do anything. And the fourth threat is the dark side of the digital world, the rise of artificial intelligence, disinformation campaigns, distortions in the perception of different systems, hacker attacks, and so on. These 4 horsemen, epic geopolitical tensions, the climate crisis, global mistrust, and the downsides of technology can jeopardize every aspect of our shared future, according to Antonio Guterres. And his solution was to propose again to pursue the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and to implement the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. The second description was the UNESCO Strategic Outlook 2022-2029, where it said that the impact of the global COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the vulnerabilities of our societies and economies with asymmetrical impacts, particularly on women and young people. It has revealed the pressures on nature and biodiversity systems and shed new light on the need to bolster humanity's capacity to tackle global shocks. It has magnified the depth of structural inequalities in societies and had led the international community to question the sustainability of the process made until then. The solution of UNESCO is multi-dimensional. It is about education, creating multi-resilient environment, about fostering participation, a renewal of globalism through new global agreements, futures literacy, so working consciously with different futures, and about strengthening focal points that are more or less uncontested, like African gender equality, although they are not practiced sufficiently. Now, just very briefly to mention that the coronavirus crisis, of course, had its impact, freezing this already torn and uncomfortable situation into paralysis and strengthening the basic motive of rupture. It is also revalued to some extent the concept of autonomy, because to stop exchanging and interacting with each other are seen as rather healthy and healing. Autonomy is seen as an antidote against overdependency, and autonomy has become a battle cry against too much globalization, where interdependency has been perceived increasingly as dependency from others. Now, when we sum up all this, then the question is, when we want to go forward and use reglobalization as a positive term, as not only as an analytic and diagnostic, but also as a constructive, to some extent, initially therapeutic term, what does that mean? And I think the coming lectures of this week will exemplify, elucidate the single aspects of it. But what can we say in an overall perspective is certainly the following. We need, and there's wide consensus about this, a fundamental reset of globalization, as Manfred Steger coined it, or as artist singer Nick Cave put it, a rehabilitation of the world. And these both connotations, reset of globalization and rehabilitation of the world, are embedded and should be integrated in the term reglobalization, which remains an experimental, descriptive, and heuristic, and not a normative term. But the discussion has already started. Should we conceive of reglobalization as a liberal, progressive counter-project against the neoliberal globalization we had so far, as single scholars like Tom Paine wants it? Or is there a great divide between reglobalization as a conservative versus a progressive program? Is it owned by the left or the right? Something the whole world after the pandemic should bounce back to its original state, because in the end it didn't work so bad. We just have it to make it a bit greener and a bit more sustainable, and everything will be fine. Others instead, like the critical left, is of the opinion that we have to remake not only the global order, but also the basic structures of capitalism in order to make it more sustainable, in order to better interrelate the globalized mechanics with local needs and challenges, so to make it better acceptable to create a localized environment instead of a simply globalized mechanism that then rolls over every reality and makes all equal to some extent in front of its overwhelming power, as it did over the last phases of development. I think there is wide consensus that reglobalization, the current state of the world, is a transition phase into an emerging new state of the world of still widely unknown patterns. Now, to understand how this situation emerged, we have to go back in the anamnetic mode and to recollect what has triggered, what has caused such a dramatic transformation of an optimistic outlook of the 90s, the happy 90s, that saw that globalization would save the world, would save the planet, would make people more similar to each other, would break down cultural and ideological biases. What has happened with all that? How comes that this has turned into something chaotic and rather unease? This would be, as said, a longer debate, and we are working on this on the Center for Advanced Studies to reconstruct the situation and the driving forces, as well as the interrelation in the basic mechanics, in order to better understand how it came to this situation and how we can also get out of it. I want here just to mention that one of the regions is the multiplying of crises since the 2000s. Interestingly, the 1990s were happy, the wall had broken down, there was the collapse of communism, there was a new alignment, there was the hope that the end of history had been reached, and this was more or less serious, not only theoretical, that a free capitalist, solidary society would triumph worldwide, that there would be a worldwide democratization that would only take time but would happen, and in the end every nation on earth would share the same traits of open society, and everybody would be happy and nobody would ever engage war against each other again, and so on. Now, the 21st century, so only about one decade after these hopes, put an end to this and transformed this in a slightly other mechanism step by step. The 21st century started with 9/11, then continued with the economic and financial crisis in 2007, the European debt crisis in 2008, migration crisis due to political upheaval and economic struggles, inequality since 2015, a crisis of legitimacy of democracy that followed up the election of Brexit and Trump as a reaction to an increasing unease with inequality and what was perceived as two open societies of the West that were penetrated by neo-authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, who in turn were not open and could not be penetrated back. And last but not least, the coronavirus pandemic in 2020-21, who was a kind of a turning point in the sense that it strengthened and increased anxiety and instability and infused a sense of lack of control into large parts of the welfare states, and especially in the wealthy populations of the world. Now, I skip the other dimensions of origins. We could talk about them in the course of the Globalization Week or in our debates. What is sure to come to an end is that the resulting pillars of the re-globalization world we live in are first a new multipolarity. It's a multicentric world, if not double or triple or whatever globalization. Globalizations multiply. There is a Western globalization, there is a Chinese globalization, there's a kind of Russian globalization, including the Arctic. There's a kind of middle power globalizations, powers that are not considered as great powers, but who partially work together to create another pole. So globalization is broken up into competing systems. There are rising authoritarian powers who take a grip on parts of globalizations without any interference of humanitarian or democratic hesitations. There's a primordial competition of systems, perhaps the most important pillar of reglobalization, with the formation of new blocks, democratic versus authoritarian. I personally regard Joe Biden's, the new US president's summit of democracy, where Biden has promised to collect and invite all democracies of the world to form a joint bloc of democracies against the new authoritarian powers, which are getting too strong. One of the most important developments in world politics as a reaction of reglobalization, of the new multipolarity, and we will see what the produced outcome of this will be or can be. There is a fact that we have competing modernity concepts, or as Martin Jacques called it, competing modernities. Some nations reach the phase of modernity just now, while others are moving beyond post-modernity. There are new currents in the West, like post-postmodernity, meta-modernity, a mindset change which wants to reconcile idealism with a new realism, with a new, more moderate stance towards the future hopes about globalizations. And of course, there is also the pluralization, diversification, transformation of the solidarity principle, which means something completely different in China than it means in Europe or in the United States, solidarity from above or solidarity from below. This will also be a kind of world war, without using inappropriate terms, but this will be a conflict that will shape the coming years and the destiny of reglobalization. What to do? Ingrid Kofler and I have coined the 5 R's of reglobalization, which means we need to refine, reframe, reform, redefine, and to revision its current status and mechanisms. Refining means we should concentrate on the present phase of transition, because it's so complex, we cannot include too many other phases, like, for example, the Romans or the big empires, who are sometimes regarded as the first phases of globalization. This is very interesting, but we need more effort on the present phase. We must reframe globalization. That means we have to think about running it differently. We have to reform it. That means we must make changes in the mechanisms and efficiencies of this system. For example, by reforming the global bodies, by taking away the veto right of the powers in the Security Council, because they are always just pursuing their interests, not those of humanity, or by enlarging the Security Council, by creating new Geneva Conventions. In any case, we must reform what has been done. That means not to destroy, but move it forward and include new ideas and mechanisms. Redefining means a more theoretical research approach, that we have to research how it could come to the present state of things and how different forces are shaping this kind of transformative status. And revisioning means to fundamentally reconsider globalization as such. We have to include those who want to finish globalization, like the Trumpianos and or the voters for Brexit. They just want to get back to a world that was more traditional, that was less complex. We cannot simply say we should leave them in the Stone Age, but they have to be taken seriously too and included in the question if globalization's future should continue or we should change the whole thing altogether. To conclude, I think it is necessary to contextualize globalization towards glocalization. That means to include more people on the ground to avoid larger parts of the population who lose from the process. We must renew the international bodies positively with a new enthusiasm by strengthening initiatives, for example, by UNESCO. And we have, perhaps in the educational sector, most important, put a new focus on working on joint futures on the basis that there is not anymore just one futures, but many, and that we don't necessarily have to reconcile these futures, but we have to consider them all in order to find a co-evolutive status of the world. My resume is, and this is the final sentence, globalization is not over. Re-globalization does not mean that the current upheaval puts an end to globalization by se. Globalization, in my view, will most probably resume and go on after the coronavirus pandemic. We are in the early stages of a restart, and after a phase of reordering or reset, but it will clearly go on in more dialectical, diverse, pluralistic, and conflictual ways than before, and we will have to deal with this. And I think on this basis, the further lectures of this week will operate to show us ways how to go forward. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roland Benedikter, for your presentation on globalization's current transition phase and reglobalization. We now have time to answer a few questions that the participants asked. The first one that I have here would be great presentation. It's a question by Hannes Obermeier. But weren't European and American happy 90s? Roland mentioned nothing but a big illusion based upon a misunderstanding of capitalism and its false and basically self-serving promises.
Well, I would say to a large extent, this is true. We observed already since the 1990s, and already Francis Fukuyama's primordial world, the end of history and the new man, was a kind of this mechanism. We observed that a mechanism was created by those who thought that liberal capitalism was the end of the story, was the best possible to achieve state. They created a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in the narratives of globalization. And that is why the early stages of globalization were so happy. They were accompanied by a narrative mostly coined by neoliberals. At that time, Francis Fukuyama was still a neoliberal. He changed afterwards a bit after in the 2000s, but initially he was part of a kind of an elite, a globalist elite, that created a narrative that all this would lead to happiness for everybody. I mean, this was then connected with narratives like trickle-down economics. If the rich get richer, everybody will get richer because a few pieces will trickle down to all the others of their wealth, and so on. There was a vast variety, a cluster of narratives that accompanied the early stages of globalizations, and that also simulated a world where there was only one single globalization, the only one that was right. After the collapse of communism, there was only the Western narrative that could be right. Why? Because China at that time was still not in the view of other major powers, was still emerging, had a huge part of its population poor. And so the West and many of the brightest minds thought this was the end of it. We have reached the stage of globalization. That is the ultimate stage, and that will work for everybody. And I agree with Hannes that this has not been fulfilled. This never held true. Even in the 1990s, the basis for rising inequality were created. The reality was that globalization, yes, fulfilled the dream of nations to become more similar. All nations took profit, or to better, more precisely say it, all national economies took profit from abolishing frontiers, from the free exchange of goods and services, and most recently also persons. But the truth is that yes, the national economies became more aligned and wealthier, but not the populations within these economies. Within these economies that got all wealthier, people became more divided, more polarized between winners and losers, because the globalization process within these societies produced many losers, like the lower strata of the population, like the workers, like the lower middle classes, who lost their job due to automation, due to outsourcing. And so that in the end, the whole package was kind of a simulacrum, because it was a narrative that promised progress to all, but in the end produced a lot of disparity and the progress for a few. If you see it, the big internet or information trusts is just one example. So I agree with you that we must rethink also the narratives of globalization if we want to go forward and really have a productive, not a destructive, a productive critique of current globalization.
Okay, thank you, Roland. Now we have two more questions. One is more a comment that is from Brunilda Tahilari, who says, I strongly believe that what the world today needs more is a re-globalization of international solidarity. Otherwise, we won't be able to tackle the climatic, social, and economic crisis adequately. And the second one would be from Eva Jakobsone, who says, so until the West benefited from abusing China and Africa, globalization was organized and good. But now when China returns to its historic place of the largest trading country in the world, and new thinking and philosophy compete with Western thoughts, now the globalization is regarded as in disorder and bad.
Yeah, can I answer just, so I think the commentary is very accurate. I believe exactly the same about solidarity. Solidarity can be even the key transformative term, or the catalyst for a new kind of re-globalization, I think. Just that solidarity is practiced very differently in authoritarian regimes, where it is basically implemented from above, imposed to the population, and in open systems, in democracies, where it comes from below, where it must be a felt feeling, of a felt approach by the population that can be easily also stirred. So the solidarity issue is, in my view, one of the decisive issues for the coming years, how we practice it within systems and in the new competition between systems. The last point, the question, I think, is particularly relevant and also very important. Do we not measure the different stages of globalization with different scales and means? It is true, and as I said, the happy years of globalization were the happy years of neoliberalism, which was kind of a narrative of happiness for everybody on a secular dimension, which did exclude basically all other cultures and civilizations which were not Western neoliberal, which means a lot of Western approaches too. And they didn't realize that China was a third power. The narrative then was indeed that China and all other powers, including the Middle East, and that was one of the reasons for the Iraq war, including Africa, including Russia, would democratize, because the end of history was reached and there was only liberal capitalism. And everybody would agree with that sooner or later. When your wealth, when your personal lifestyle increases and improves, you become democratic, so to say. You become tolerant and you want to live free in an open society. And this would ultimately affect everyone, even the Chinese and the Russians and the Africans and whoever. And I think this has produced until the present day an analysis which is a little bit biased. And I am torn in myself in this regard too. I think we do a bad work if we see the whole globalization issue from a Western standpoint and then say there are other powers who to some extent interfere with it, and it could be better without them. On the other hand, we must recognize that China has made a difficult development. And something similar is even true for Russia and other powers, for the Middle East, for sure, for Turkey and other powers as well. So there was an economic progress, but mixed with a political and social regress. We never had such an authoritarian power in China since Mao Zedong. Perhaps Xi Jinping is even more powerful and more lonely on the top than all his predecessors ever were. So China has added to astounding and incomparable economic progress, which has freed so many millions from poverty, rightly so, with an always more tighter political control and system, an always more authoritarian behavior, an exuberance of its leaders, that is really going at the edge of what will be tolerated by the global community. And we see this in a lot of warning signs. So I think we should not measure globalization unjustly by a Eurocentric or Western-centric view, but we must also see where the limits of authoritarian regimes are, and we must fight against the takeover of democracies by neo-authoritarian regimes who do everything to impose their system to us. And they have a slightly easier game because we have open systems, they have closed systems. They can interfere with us, we can't with them. So this is a two-edged sword, and I'm really happy that you asked this question, because we have to take into consideration both parts, both aspects.